So I'd like to welcome to the, everybody to the panel talking about what are we talking about? Defining the future: initiatives to lead the next generation of internet video. We have three very distinguished participants here today who lend a lot to the discussion. Len, you ready? Cool. I'd like to welcome our first panelist. Doesn't need an introduction, but I'll give him one anyway. Bob Pepper, who is Vice President of Global Technology Policy over at Cisco. Bob, if you would, please. And I just have to open up your panel. View, full page. Why do I? Yeah, there it is.
Great.
There you go.
Thanks, Jason. And actually, thanks to Richard, because as I said to him, I was trying to think about, so trying to pull some of this together at the end of the day, and what are some of the issues, pulling it back actually to Ellie's opening presentation this morning, as well as to the to Ellie's longer presentation. So I am going to present some of the data that you've seen bits and pieces of, but I'm going to tie it back to some of these core questions. The data, I think you're all familiar with our annual Visual Networking Index study, but this is looking from the latest specifically at some of the video forecast. Also, what we mean by video, the range of video, and then some of the questions about the impact on IP video and IP networks, because the title of the conference and Ellie's point is about cloud TV, right? TV available, video available over the net, over IP networks, based in the cloud. What are the implications? What are the policy questions? So I'm going to just go through a couple of things here just to put this in context. There's been a lot of discussion about video is growing. Brent just did some of that. Globally, what we're seeing is that by 2018, globally, video is going to account for about 75% of internet traffic. It's actually going to be a little bit more of IP traffic, right? Because internet traffic is a subset of all IP. There are IP managed networks, managed services, and on those, especially in the US, video is even a little bit more. But this is sort of internet video. It'll be 75%. In the US, you heard it's going to be 78%. Earlier, and I'll come back to this, when I was showing this to Jason earlier, he said, well, gee, wasn't an earlier forecast up to 85%, right, a little higher? The answer was yes, but I'll show you why that was in terms of the adjustment pushing it out a little bit. So it probably won't hit the 85% until maybe 2020. But we're very, very careful. We only forecast 5 years out. Going beyond that, we think, actually is a real problem in terms of any reliability. This is, as you can see, it's a 5-year forecast, but it's a 5-year rolling forecast, right? Because every year we go forward 5 years. We've been doing this for 9 years, so we actually can go back and check, which we do, and we report out on that. So we actually can go back and look, what did we forecast 6 years ago for last year? And when we do that, we consistently within 10%, usually on the conservative side, not always, but usually. So within a 10% error of margin on a 5-year forecast in a dynamic industry is not bad. So I'm pretty confident in the numbers, but they are not exact. It's a forecast. What do we mean by types of video? So here, when we're looking at short form, which is less than 8 minutes or 8 or 10 minutes, but let's say 8 minutes, long form, including movies, the Netflix, the things that we were talking about all day. Extra long form is a lot of that is sports, because that's like 2 hours, 3 hours, or cricket matches. I don't think there's anybody here who, maybe Richard, but they go on for days. And then just now, within the last year, beginning to see micro videos. These are, Vines. These are the little video clips. This is Twitter video. This is some of the short clips on Facebook. This is in number of minutes, billions of minutes, and you can see the distribution. In terms of billions of minutes, most of the video is still the short form. It's a lot of YouTube video. Again, this is global. In terms of global internet video, what we're seeing, though, notwithstanding this, in terms of the internet traffic, in terms of petabytes per month, long form is already 2/3 and it's growing up to 3/4. So long form video, so this reflects earlier what we saw, the growth of Netflix, the growth of other examples of the long form video in terms of the consumption of the internet traffic, right? So there's the minutes of video, and then there's the overall the traffic, and part of that is related to the device on which the video is viewed, right? Because the device matters. A lot of this is on smartphones, on tablets. More of this is on tablets, PCs, as well as connected TVs. When we look across the globe, on the left is the share of video minutes. On the right is the share of videos viewed. And what you see, there are a couple of interesting things. One, the countries where social media is a bigger deal is where we see the micro videos growing, right? Brazil, China, UK, US. But in terms of the share of video minutes, right, the micros are almost nothing. But long form video, but what jumps out at me here, and you'll see this in a few minutes, China and Japan really stand out when it comes to long form video sites, long form video minutes, and long form share of videos viewed, right? And this goes to something, Richard, that you talked about, which are the concerns in Europe about regulating platforms. The meme being in search, we have to maybe look at the dominance of a U.S. company in search. In social media in Europe, the concern about U.S. company in social media. Why aren't there more global companies, or why aren't there more European companies in the space, and do we have to regulate it? Of course, regulation is not the answer to create innovation, but what we're seeing, and you'll see this explicitly in a moment, that this is not just being driven by U.S. companies at all. There's a lot. In fact, if you look, I'll show you, the Asian companies are really, in some ways, leading or becoming the leaders. And this is a global phenomenon. North America and Asia, and a little bit in Europe. And there's a question in the European context is why is there not more innovation in Europe? Different devices have different consumption patterns, and I already referenced this briefly. If you look at the 2013, just as an example, a PC, the variables here, the processor chip, the chips on board, the processors, as well as the resolution and size of the display drive the data consumed by the device. If I substitute a smartphone for a connected PC, and Richard, you know this better than any of us because 2012, this was the year in Vodafone where the dongle business basically was replaced by the smartphone. And as you began to replace the connected PC with a dongle, with a smartphone, the amount of data going across the net being consumed actually went down. But but that was a temporary decline adjusted for the device, and now it's gone back up because the number of smartphones that are connected has grown way, way faster than the number of PCs using dongles has shrunk. So it's past, you have to go past the substitution factor. One of the things that we saw this year for the first time, and again referencing back to John Kerry this morning, the adoption of 4K TV. We didn't see this in the past. This year we saw it for the first time. 3D TV completely failed. Nobody wanted it, right? 4K TV, we think, is taking off. Now, if you look at the left, this, by the way, is connected TVs. So this is not broadcast. We're forecasting 20% of global connected TVs are going to be 4K by 2018, about 200 million. But you look at that hockey stick curve doubling year over year on the adoption side. It's not just that people are watching more video, but when they're watching HD or they're watching 4K ultra high definition TV, it consumes more data. Standard definition consumes about 2 megabits per second on connected internet connection, HD 7 megabits per second, and up to 18 megabits per second for 4K. So what does that mean in terms of the traffic? In terms of global, this is IP video traffic. So this is IP with internet included. So this is not just internet, so this is also managed IP services. Globally, what we see is that the standard definition video in terms of petabytes per month is growing slightly, but it's pretty flat. But as a percentage, it's declining from 2/3 to about 1/3. High definition growing from about a little more than 1/3 to half. And ultra high definition from 0.1% of traffic to 11%. In the U.S., high definition is already 50% of the connected TV video traffic, going to 2/3. On the ultra high definition is going to be about 14%. Now, I know I'm not. Let me just, Corey, just one. This is the point that this is not just a U.S. phenomenon. Google, YouTube. This is, by the way, measured by petabytes per month. Yes, about 1,900 petabytes per month, or about 2 exabytes. FC2, Japan. Youku and Tudu, China. Dawango, Japan. Right? And you go through these, including Sohu.com. Then you have Netflix, then Tencent, then Facebook. Some of it's long form, some of it's short form, but this is global, including in Russia, mail.ru. Right? Question. Again, because it was already raised, because again, Richard raised this, which is concerns about platform dominance, and the regulators in Europe raising the question. If I look at this, this is a global market. There are global platforms. There are global providers. Why are there not more in Europe? And yes, the regulators in Europe and policymakers in Brussels are concerned about not having more European content. Question why, when in fact the barriers to entry don't seem to be that great, and we have a lot of platforms growing up globally around the world. So, Eve, this is actually a real question. I don't know the answer, right? But this is a question, some data that frames it a little differently. Peak over average. What we are seeing, and again, this is sort of evidenced by all of this happening globally. I don't care what region you're in, right? Today, by the way, peak hour. So peak hour traffic flows about 2.5 times, not percent, 2.5x today, growing to 3.5x peak over the average hour traffic. Peak hour is sometime, it's an hour in the evening, depending upon the country, between 9 p.m. and 1 a.m. Right? The internet absolutely has become the next prime time means of delivering video, TV, in the home, where that's actually being used. So that has major implications for network architectures in terms of peak over average. It's not just average flows. Now, going back to some of the other things that Richard raised in terms of the policy questions, right? There is, and we talked about this earlier, Ellie laid out all of these, issues, right? Well, if I look at these things, the V chip is not going to be imposed on these platforms. Protecting children is an issue. It's already an issue. And the question is, how do you protect children in terms of video? Right? There are copyright questions, regional copyright questions. We don't have a single market in Europe for content because of national copyright, right? If you talk to the Hollywood people, they say they don't want a national market, although you'd think it might be easier. And that's because they can charge more for films on a per capita basis in Germany than in Greece, or in France than Greece. So some of the content providers while you might think it'd be easier to negotiate once for Europe, they don't want to do that because of the different markets that have evolved over time in terms of revenue and business models. But there are a lot of the legacy players, broadcasters in particular, that like regulation because they view it as a way to protect their market and market share. And their, quote, special position in terms of being national content providers and protecting themselves from competition from content video providers such as this. And that leads me to, again, another one of Richard's, actually two of Richard's points. One, what is the role of public service broadcasting in this world? The BBC is a leader in this world, right? Even though it's a public service broadcaster. But then there's more generally the question which we're seeing in the US, we're seeing everywhere, which is this existential threat. I love the way Richard framed it. The existential threat to free over-the-air TV, or DTT, digital terrestrial television, in a world, right, that is moving to this in which they're still going to be there, but they may no longer be special. And up to now, or up to recently, terrestrial broadcasters and the relationship with government, they've been viewed as special, and they actually like the regulation because the regulation makes them special. In this new world, they may be less special. And that's the existential threat, which is leading to calls for regulation, legacy broadcast regulation on the cloud TV. Thank you.
Thank you, Pepper. I'm going to take a second just to ask you a question while I also load up Professor Waverman's slides. My question to you is, I saw a very interesting statistic that you had up there, which is that basically around the world, with the exception of China and Japan, by a 3-to-1 margin, short-form video is the video that's dominating.
Online.
Online. But short-form video is a very flash-in-the-pan, very new feature. It's something, what, maybe 10 years old, 11 years old, if you want. I mean, we can go back to maybe Atom TV to like the late 90s, but it's still very relatively new compared to, long-form video. It's the new kid on the block, and therefore it's very popular, and, people like the idea of having their own produced footage now, but long-term, it's going to go back to long-term, long video?
So first of all, you saw the slide with long-form growing faster than short-form.
Exactly.
But you're making another really important point, which was raised on the, I think, Brent, you raised it, which is video is also two-way video, but it's also user consumer-produced video. And a lot of the short-form video is user consumer-produced. That's not the long-form video, right? And we're going to continue to see a lot of that, but in terms of the number of videos, yes, but in terms of the data, the throughput, and the data consumption is going to come from the long form. So it's not either or. The answer to your question is yes.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. I'd like to introduce our second speaker for the panel, the Dean of the DeGroote School of Business, who I think is going to give us a little bit of an interesting view from our neighbors in the north in Canada, Len Waverman. Len?
As Heather said a little earlier, and this also follows up on what Richard Feesby was talking about, the last 10 days in Canada, we've had these hearings called on television in Canada, the Canadian Radio Television Commission, winding up today with Netflix. And so timing is great. So there are two issues, as I'll draw them out very quickly. One is moving to skinny bundles, because at the moment the bundles that consumers get in Canada are incredibly large. CRTC wants to impose skinny bundles. The second one is what to do about Canadian content. Now, as a Canadian, Canadian content began with music. Music was before television. And so therefore Justin Bieber, if you think of Justin Bieber, he's Canadian. There are 4 parts to music: music, artist, performance, and lyrics. So with Justin Bieber, if he's performing music and it's recorded in Toronto, it's Canadian content. And so that is good because on radio, 30% of music has to be Canadian. The Toronto Symphony, playing Beethoven. Beethoven clearly starts with B, is not Canadian. Toronto Symphony could have all foreign musicians, but it's Canadian because it's Toronto. If it records in Toronto, that's good, it's Canadian content. If it records for Deutsche Grammophon in Berlin, it's foreign content. So you can see that it says here, these are very simple rules. This comes from the CRTC website. These are very simple rules. They're stupid rules because what's Canadian content? How does that mean Canadian identity? But when you move into television, and when you think about, I'm a firm believer of the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, a firm believer in Canadian content. Question is, as in Europe, as there are many countries who have content laws, how do you handle these laws in the world of everything we've been talking about, in the world of Netflix? All right. So here's the hearing on Let's Talk TV, which has been going on. Theme 1 is on this imposing a small basic bundle, but in that small basic bundle you have BDUs, are broadcast distribution undertakings, and then you have to include, of course, all the local Canadian stations, so there won't be much room in local basic for American stations. But and then they've offered two options. One is just small skinny bundle, and the second one is we're going to cap the price. Which one of those do you like? There's not much of an optionality there. But, okay. What I want to talk about is what they call preponderance. So there are two options given in this hearing. Option A is the BDUs, broadcast distribution undertakings, would be required to ensure that each subscriber receives a preponderance of Canadian services. Subscribers would have to receive more Canadian channels than non-Canadian channels. Now, how do we guarantee that? And everything we've been talking about today of IP video, how do you enforce Len Waverman to watch Canadian content? Right. Option B, receive. Okay, I know, receive. But how am I receiving it? On what device are they talking about? Well, what decade, what century are they in? And then the second option, only options A and B. Options B is I have to be offered more Canadian than non-Canadian, but they won't monitor what I actually buy. So I would think B is probably preferable to A. But what this also involves around is something called the PNI fund. PNI means Programs of National Interest. What that is every broadcast distribution undertaking has to put between 5 to 9% of profitability or sometimes of revenues into a fund that goes for the providers of Canadian content. Okay? And so now we have Netflix. So Netflix has no office in Canada, does not have a Canadian employee, does not pay taxes or anything to the Canadian government. So today I have here the exchange that occurred between Corey Wright, who is the global public policy director for Netflix, and the CRTC chairman, Jean-Pierre Blais, where he said, but we have to worry about Canadian content. And she said, well, we can't get anything out of the PNI fund, so we can't access your content fund. So why should we pay into it? And we have a lot of Canadian content on Netflix. He said to her, would you share with us confidentially the data? And she says, I can't do that. And he said, you're going to. And she said no, and he stormed out of the room. So he then came back, but extremely angry. Now the problem is the Canadian Prime Minister who started off conservative but has become kind of a man of the people, has come up publicly and saying we will not tax anything on the internet. So again, we're into the issue of what we call a price, how we pay for things like infrastructure or Canadian content, and what is a tax. And so I would not be surprised if the CRTC tries to impose a PNI, put Netflix into the PNI fund, and that the Canadian government will veto it. But these are the kinds of issues that Richard was talking about in Europe, and these are valid social concerns, right? These are really valid social concerns. Now, I was just reviewing a book by a great guy at the University of Toronto Law School, Mike Tribilco, called Dealing with Losers. I thought it meant he knew my faculty. Don't take that. I didn't say that. But the political economy policy transitions. And he quotes Bismarck, "Politics is the art of the possible. It is not a science, as the professors are apt to suppose." And so remember Gordon Tulloch's great 1975 article on the great problem is how do we, because when we put in regulations, when we put in something like Canadian content rules and this PNI fund, we are creating winners. And so we have a coalition of Canadian producers of film, Canadian composers, Justin Bieber, who actually gets money out of this fund. I know it's sad, but you know, how do we as academics and as watchers of the industry, we're all concerned about a lot of these issues, but I think we haven't moved to the next realm. How do we change it? How do we get from the position of creating these rules which have enabled forms to groups to form and for valid purposes? So how do we then ensure we can get French content or Belgian content or Canadian content without going through these mechanisms and recognizing that the world has changed? We take it just out of general tax revenue. So you know, how do we do this is the question. Thanks.
Thank you, Len. I do have one quick question before. Oh, no, it's no problem. One quick question for you, Len. Just a quick question for you. So you were talking about the 30% rule in Canada, and the fact that so how does that rule basically deal with Le Québécois? The fact that you guys have two distinct markets.
There are separate rules for separate rules for Quebec, and therefore it has to be French music.
So basically, Netflix would not only have to provide 30% Canadian content; it would have to present 30% French Canadian content as well.
I'm not sure how that fund actually gets divided. So Quebec is 8 million people of the population of 35 million. So I don't know whether it's based on population. I don't know enough of the details of how that works.
Okay, so we're going to just open up this. There we go. I'd like to introduce the final speaker of the day. So let's give him plenty of attention here. Professor of Law from the University of Munster, Mern Holtznagel.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I feel especially honored to sit on the panel with two such distinguished persons who actually I followed them during my whole academic career. Bob Pepper is well known. I think you have been at the FCC, sorry if I'm wrong. And Len Waverman is somebody whom I know since my studies at McGill, where I actually studied the Canadian quota system. And that now Professor Trebilcock, who is now a colleague from Toronto, comes up, make my day, I can tell you. I will grab some points and not just speaking on what you were saying. Or what I prepared to say. There has been basically, or there are two models to preserve public interest in broadcasting in Europe. One is more the British model to rely on the BBC or somehow state public service broadcasters. And the other model is more the French model, that one allows private enterprises a lot to do, but then somehow orders them to accept quota systems and pay in funds. We have now this debate, how to get our old regulation transferred to the new world, is a pretty old one. We discussed this even in Canada, I think around 10 or 15 years, and it has been always debated whether we should put Canadian content on computer servers, and half of this has to be Canadian, and so on and so forth. All instruments have been discussed in Europe too. The present debate on the multimedia or the media service directive, however, I think goes in a slightly different trend. I think direction. I think that in general these quota systems and also the subsidy systems will kept alive for the French-speaking world. The Germans and the British have never bought this model. They will rather reduce the standards or the burden for the private TV firms to get the same competitive environment as you have for Netflix. So I see rather a trend to deregulate the high broadcasting standard. One could think, on the other hand, to lift up the standard for Netflix. That is not an option. Nobody discusses this. The issue comes up whether one could tax the American or the international firms more. I discovered during my stay now in Charlottesville at the law school that this is a common problem. Almost no society is capable to tax these guys. So maybe the Europeans will try. I haven't seen any concept that is somehow promising. So in this regard, I think there is, in this broadcasting area, rather no development. It will just stay. The countries will try to preserve their systems how they are. Governments will see themselves more and more in a role of protecting their firms. If it comes to broadband rollout, that is essential for the video, TV, how you call it, it is very hard to fulfill the aims set by the Commission. Universal service will not cover more than 2 megabit or 3 megabit. I think this approach is very weak if you compare to the United States. Where we made a lot of progress is on the level of municipalities. They sometimes are the leaders in broadband rollout, even if it comes to fiber networks. I leave network out and would like to say something to Bob Pepper's statement. Yes, I'm very surprised since weeks being here also at the conference at George Mason that nobody spoke about China. I've been to China last year and visiting Baidu, Alibaba and Tencent, and these people are strong. And if you go with a metro, you see that you have basically 5 YouTube platforms and they are preserving long video of platforms. I don't know how they manage and where you can get this and where not. They have obviously these glass fiber networks in their huge buildings, and if you go to the rural areas, you can find nothing. Even in this area of net neutrality, I learned in Washington that China tried to resolve this conflict between the Chinese telco companies and the huge internet firms. They tried to introduce a rule that charged WhatsApp, this service, more. So they tried to set up quality categories of transport and to force the internet firms to pay more. The customers went nuts and somehow abolished this rule, what is somehow remarkable because one used to think about China as a very central state. If one visits China, one realizes it's not as central and it's often very hard to implement rules at all, even though it's a communist society. So the question comes up then, if China is in this regard leading, I already posed one question, why don't we know more? I didn't hear any talk about this on the Washington conference, but also in Europe you hardly speak about China. It's something like a blank page, and therefore I'm especially thankful that you enrolled some of these data. If it comes to Europe, it's somehow hard to know what is going on there, at least from my point of view. Very often the case is made that if we reduce regulation for the telcos, the problem is being resolved. They just would like to earn more by reduced regulations, what can be positive because then you are capable to make investments. On the other hand, I don't believe that we can really catch up because there seems to be a lack of innovation in Europe, and it's also a problem that we have these fragmented markets, so it's very heavy burden to really gain from these network effects. I think these are open questions. I don't know the answers. As our chancellor said, the internet is new land, and I think she's right, at least for us. Thank you very much.
Well, I'd like to thank all of the speakers on our panel and now open up any questions to the audience. Anybody?
Hi, it's Susan Kraus, Green Corsair Tech Labs, and this is quite an exciting presentation. When you mention Europe, the lack of innovation, it's not actually the scientific innovation that's lagging, it's actually the implementation. Is that not correct? And especially in Germany, which is at the forefront of science in engineering. I would think it's not the lack of innovation in terms of engineering or physics, but rather the cost of implementation. Would that be your view?
I observe that Germany now decides to defend the old companies, and there is some of the collaboration between politicians, the elite of them, and the elites of business. And there's not so much an openness. So I think it's an elite failure in Germany.
Yeah, I would agree with the root of your question. It's not about the technology. It's about business innovation. It's about business models, and it's also a climate. Now, if you look at the number of startups, for example, in Berlin, it's growing dramatically, and so that's actually a really good sign. It's very, very healthy. But when I met with them about 6 weeks ago, there's an association of German startups.
Yeah.
And they actually have proposed to government, they said one of their biggest problems were that there are all kinds of business, the time it takes to start a business, the paperwork needed to start a business, and including labor laws, even they don't make this, they're not the distinctions between a startup or a small company and some of the medium-sized companies. And so they felt that it was really more about not technology innovation, but the ability to have to attract venture capital, the ability to take risks, and to the ability. One of them, and I don't know whether it's true. Maybe you know that if you take risks, if you start a company and you fail, there's certain legal liabilities associated with failure, and therefore, their concern was how do you create an environment where you encourage risk-taking as entrepreneurs to try things that maybe hadn't been done. But I think that there are issues having to do with innovation around business models more than, technologies are being developed. There's some very cool technologies, and there's some very forward-looking, disruptive, in a good sense, innovative companies. Just take a look at Iliad in France. Very disruptive, and some people they would say it's too disruptive. But there's a lot of innovation going on in Europe, and yet there's still a lot of hand-wringing that there's not enough. I mean, I defer maybe, to you. I mean, you're the European experts, or to Lorenzo, or I mean,
What has been disruptive is the other, specifically.
Can't hear you.
oh, they need the mic, Corey.
It's not movable. Oh, you can.
Yeah, what has been disruptive with Iliad is not only the technology but the business model. It has been cheap, it has been easy, and basically what they've done well everything what Orange was not doing well. And also they've built from scratch a company. They've built a network, but not all the network, and they focus on price, on also easiness. One-stop shop for everything, and they've been very successful. That's what I was saying when I introduced the session. Now, he understood that giving the power to users, it will make a very successful company against the traditional incumbent behaviors, which is, this is what I got, take it or leave it, and you have no choice. So that's how it works.
I think you see, it's again. I'm a little bit insisting that the people who lead the country in the political sphere as well as in the business sphere, they are not open for this digital economy, and that has to do with culture. If you look at this Uber stuff, which is simultaneously here and there. You see, I see that here business would say, okay, there are legal rules, but we go around. In Germany, a legal rule is a legal rule. I think in France too. That is one cultural strange business. You are in a much more, in this common law tradition that's more flexible than ours. That is one reason. But I think in general, the people are open to try to make business, and that's something very much rooted in the society. In Germany, you would rather become a civil servant than a businessman. You can change from one area to the other. This is very general, but that is at one point. And the other point you should not underestimate are these tremendous network effects. You see, I learned from Mr. Ma when I visited. I didn't visit Mr. Ma, but vice president of Alibaba. You see, they just copied the Google model, and it worked because the market is so huge. And then they run into problems with their telcos, and the telcos do not invest in rural areas like ours, and so on. The problems are everywhere the same. The political, you see, the political background does not matter so much. And in this regard, we really have this European crisis that basically the countries are working against each other and not together.
Heather, I know you've got a question?
Yeah, just a comment. Couple comments and then a question. I think first the Alaska example I gave earlier and the Canadian content one you heard now are kind of two examples of where the rubber hits the road. It's hitting either different roads or different parts of the road, but in Canada or in Alaska you see just a dramatic example of connectivity issues, affordability issues, and maybe competition issues. They exist in other places, but they just jump out at you. In Canada, the Canadian content issue, or how do you foster or preserve, depending on your point of view, content in a small country or a minority culture? It could be in some places in the kind of digital world that you're describing. So I think it's interesting that the CRTC is trying to take on that issue. And clearly the models, as Len described them, don't apply very well, or maybe apply at all. But the issue is one that's not gone away in Canada, although it seems to be one. I had a colleague who was on afterwards talking about First Nations and Indigenous media, and I heard one of the commissioners ask him for more data. What's the evidence of the point you're trying to make? And we find that there's a lack of evidence, I think, about, so what are Canadians actually watching anyway? And I can go back to when I was a lowly grad student at Stanford, and I did a research project looking at what Canadians watched in cities where they had access to cable and where they didn't. Now everyone has access to cable one way or another. And the point was that even though they had only a couple of Canadian channels in the remote city, which at that time was Edmonton, and a bunch of over-the-air channels and cable in Vancouver, for example, Canadians watched American content for entertainment and sports anywhere they could get it, on the Canadian channel rebroadcasting it or on the Seattle or whatever channel. But they watched Canadian news and public affairs, and some other programs. But generally, the number of choices wasn't particularly relevant. But what I'd like to know is, do you know, Len, or does anybody know, what are Canadians watching now? And is this, you know, are they really, when they want to watch something Canadian, they can find it, whether they've got 10 choices or 100 choices of channels, some of which are Canadian channels with Canadian and other content, some of which are U.S. channels without Canadian content?
Heather, I don't know the answer to that. It is tracked. The biggest complaint to the CRTC in this hearing from consumers is that Canadians don't get Super Bowl ads. Because we have a policy called commercial deletion and substitution. So programs that are sold both in the U.S. and Canada, obviously the U.S. broadcast, the broadcaster, the signal goes into Canada, but they don't have the rights to receive monies for it. So the advertisements are deleted. And when it's sold to Canada, we get different ads. So the prime complaint to the CRTC is we want to see Super Bowl ads. So what's content anyways? So.
But that's a good, I mean, that's two issues. One is people want to watch the Super Bowl no matter what. The other is Canadians have a way of monetizing. Yeah, Canadians want to watch the Super Bowl, and now the ads are the more innovative part of the Super Bowl, no matter what. But the other point is that Canadian networks have found a way of monetizing this for decades by saying, yeah, we'll put our own ads on with American content. So that's part of the business model.
Yeah, well, apropos our other discussions, so Rogers and Shaw in Canada have launched something called Show Me, SHOWMI, which is their version of a Netflix fighter. And so they're signing up content from American shows like Modern Family in order to be an alternative to Netflix. And as we were talking about, I think Raul was saying, I mean, they have one great advantage is they're multi-channel. I mean, Netflix is Netflix. But what Rogers can buy is not just the subscription rights, the subscriber or the SVOD rights, but they can also buy the linear rights. So Rogers can buy multiple rights to a show where Netflix just wants the subscriber rights. And so they are outbidding Netflix for programming for the Canadian market. And I think that's another Achilles heel of Netflix, is the ability of broadcasters in other countries to buy multiple windows of the same program or a film and offer it in different ways that Netflix can't do. So that's just been launched a few weeks ago.
We have time for two more quick questions. Richard?
It's actually more of a comment. I just wanted to pick up on Bernd's comments. One of the things that strikes me, listening both about the broadcasting debate, but also from my experience in telecoms, is what the internet is really doing is forcing at least.
Please speak a little bit louder.
Sorry. What the internet is really doing in Europe is forcing us to be clearer about the kind of boundary between public and private sector activities. And so the reality is we still run telecoms companies, or many telecoms companies in Europe, as if they are quasi-public bodies. They're not run fundamentally as commercial organizations in the way that internet companies are run, or indeed some other. These large telecoms companies are still major employers. subject to all sorts of political constraints. And the same is true of broadcasting. We don't, although ostensibly large parts of European broadcasting are, held by our friends at Fidelity and the sort of people that Ellie talked about, they're not run like that. They're run in a sort of quasi-public, quasi-commercial way. And one of the things it seems to me that the internet is forcing people to do is to get clearer about the boundaries between these things. I don't think going forward you will be able to run these businesses in that ambiguous way. You will either, I suspect, have to move clearly to a more explicitly publicly subsidized provision of things that you care about. And there's a model for that. Or essentially you're going to have to really unshackle some of these organizations and allow them to operate on a purely commercial basis. But I think a lot of businesses in Europe where we worry about this innovation problem, part of the answer is because we are still ambivalent, really, about what sort of entities many of these organizations are.
Is this so with Vodafone?
And Yves?
Yeah, but Vodafone is a private company. Yeah. It's not half public.
Yes, I will add that beyond the public subsidized or the place of the public sector, there is another things to move in Europe if you want to have a more modern regulatory environment, is to stop the prohibition that we have for the TV station to keep the copyright of their program in which they invest. As you may know, it was a situation in US maybe 20 years ago. The TV channels were not able to be in the same, to merge with the studio, Hollywood studios. It's no more the case. And tomorrow, copyright will be a key point for the company strategy. If we don't give to the TV station in a country like France the ability to keep the copyright of the program in which they are investing, they will be not able to compete. And so the separation between TV programming and capacity when you fund the program to keep the copyright is very important.
So, Bernd, you had a comment?
You see, if you compare the US and China, one thing is similar, that is that you have right from the beginning a mass population that you can attract. And the second one is that the youth is desperately, seeking to use new technologies. And these are two of the striking schemes of both societies. If you meet young Chinese, they jump from one service to the other that is new. And maybe that is similar to Europe too, but maybe the markets were too small. And if they are innovators, then they are now very soon sold off by Google or by others. So by American firms. And I predict that soon Chinese companies will come too to Europe and try to enter the market. So I don't know any solution. It's so far an open question. I think we have to discuss this open in Europe and see what we can do.
And on that note, I'd like to thank our panel. Thank you, everybody, and also to all of our speakers today. It's been great. Just to give a last overview of the conference and to say his